If you drive north up Canada's western provinces by way of the Alaska, Cassiar, Mackenzie, or Liard highways, you will leave southerly civilization behind for an inexpressibly vast tract of wilderness. A lonely domain, as beautiful as it is unforgiving. Far to the west, beyond Canadian territory, is the American state of Alaska, home to the Aleutian Islands, sprawling glaciers, and the tallest mountain in the continent. Sharing a border with the so-called Last Frontier is Canada's Yukon Territory, a land of frozen forests and emerald lakes, where prospectors once toiled beneath the midnight sun in the last great gold rush of the 19th century. To the east is Nunavut, the domain of the Inuit, where huge herds of caribou and swarms of black flies dominate an endless expanse of lake-ridden tundra. Further to the north, beyond the Arctic Circle, lies the Arctic Archipelago, a sprawling collection of desolate islands in the Arctic Ocean. And in the heart of northern Canada are the Northwest Territories, home to two freshwater seas which rival the Great Lakes in size, and the mysterious Mackenzie Mountains, which harbors the storied Nakani Valley. From the Bering Sea to Hudson's Bay, the various Inuit, Dene, Cree, and Northwest Coast nations who call the North Country home all have campfire stories about wildmen. Dangerous, often hairy creatures which stalk their prey beneath the northern lights, distinguished from their southern counterparts by their predatory nature and their willingness to hunt human beings. In this video, we will revisit 3 pieces on northern wildman legends previously published on this channel. First, we will return to one of my oldest and most popular videos on the legend of the Nakani, the hairy, red-eyed giant of the Mackenzie Mountains, in which many Dene tribes once lived in perpetual terror. Next, we will revisit another old video on other boreal wildmen, from the deceptive Kushtaka of Tlingit legend, said to prowl the shores and waterways of the northwest coast, to the gaunt, grey-skinned Wendigo of Cree folklore, the physical manifestation of an evil man-eating spirit. Lastly, we will take a look at my old video on the so-called Tailed Ones, a race of ferocious, monkey-like creatures, supposed to have once dwelled near the borders of Alaska, Yukon, and British Columbia. Enjoy.
That he had nowhere seen the slightest Indian sign bore out the redskin reports that the country was taboo and recalled their superstitions that it was haunted by a race of prehistoric troglodytes, or Nakanis as they called them, with repulsive gargoyle-like faces who lived in caves cut from the living rock. Creatures reported to be twice the size of ordinary humans, who never missed a chance to carry off unwary hunters or stray squaws in their powerful gorilla-like arms. Philip H. Godsell, The Curse of Dead Man's Valley, 1950.
From the Yowie of Australia, to the Yeren of China, to the Yeti of the Himalayas, huge hairy wildmen feature in folklore around the world, and Canada is no exception. Undoubtedly, the Great White North's most famous wildman is the Sasquatch, the shy, reclusive giant said to roam the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, often colloquially referred to as Bigfoot. Less well known are the Sasquatch's coastal counterparts, the emaciated, long-haired Bakwas, or Wild Man of the Woods, said to haunt the rivers and streams of Vancouver Island and the Queen Charlotte Sound, and the huge, dim-witted Zunaqua of Kwakiut and Nootka legend, an old, black-skinned, red-lipped ogress purported to snatch up mischievous children and carry them off in a basket to her forest lair. More obscure wildmen have been reported in other parts of the country, from the Rocky Mountains of western Alberta to the Rocky Highlands of Labrador. Perhaps most mysterious of all, however, are the various subhuman hominids said to inhabit the taiga, tundra, and alpine areas of the Canadian North. Among the most prominent of these are the Nakani. Long before 18th century Scottish explorer Sir Alexander Mackenzie dipped his paddle into the river which would come to bear his name, Dene tribes from all over the north, from the eastern shores of the Mackenzie River to the forests of Alaska, spoke of a mysterious wildman who harassed them at night, often lurking in the shadows just beyond the light of the campfire. The Dene were terrified of these elusive creatures, who were as vividly real to them as the wolf and the raven, and went to great lengths to avoid crossing paths with them. One of the first frontiersmen to write about these wild men was Father Emile Petito, a 19th century oblate missionary who lived among the Slavey and the Satu Dene of the North Country's two Great Lakes. In 1876, Petito wrote of a fear that spread among the Indians each summer like an epidemic.
They live at times in continual terror of an imaginary enemy who pursues them without rest and who they believe to see everywhere, even though he doesn't exist at all.
According to ethnographer Cornelius B. Osgood, belief in the Nakani was strong among the Slavey, Dogrub, and Satu Dene as late as 1929. When they suspected that a Nakani was lurking nearby, entire Dene bands would often abandon their camps and seek shelter on a nearby lake island, secure in the belief that their pursuer, for one reason or another, was unable to cross over to their new campsite from the shore. On other occasions, according to a Hudson's Bay Company trader named John Firth, entire encampments would instead stand their ground and fire their muskets
into the forest at supposititious wanderers in the night.
According to HBC trader B.R. Ross in his 1879 report entitled Notes on the Tene or Chippewayan Indians of British and Russian America,
a strange footprint or any unusual sound in the forest is quite sufficient to cause great excitement in the camp. At Fort Resolution, I have on several occasions caused all the natives encamped around to flock for protection into the fort during the night, simply by whistling, hidden in the bushes. My train of hauling dogs also, of a large breed of great hunters, would, in crashing through the branches in pursuit of an unfortunate hare, frighten some women out gathering berries, who would rush in a frantic haste to the tents and fearfully relate a horrific account of some strange painted Indians whom they had seen. It was my custom in the spring, during the wild fowl season, to sleep outside at some distance from the fort. Numerous were the cautions that I received from the natives of my foolhardiness in doing so.
The names that the Indians applied to their mysterious unseen enemies varied from place to place and from tribe to tribe. To the Slavey, Casca, and Mountain Indians of Mackenzie country, they were Nakani. The Gwich'in, who lived further to the north in the frozen forests that skirt the Arctic Circle, referred to them as Mahoney. The Koyukon Indians of the Yukon River Valley called these creatures Nakentlia, or sneakers, while the Tainana of southwest Alaska referred to them as Nantina, or hairy men. Other appellatives included Bad Indian, Bellowing Man, and Bushman. Although the labels attached to these wild men were numerous, Indian descriptions of them were eerily consistent across the Northland. Most 19th and 20th century frontiersmen who wrote about the Nakani in their books and journals were under the impression that the Dene regarded them as hairy cannibalistic giants, vaguely human in appearance, with red eyes and long muscular arms. According to English adventurer Michael H. Mason, in his 1924 book The Arctic Forests, the Gwich'in of Peel River Country in northern Yukon described the Nakani, or the Mahoney as they called them, as
terrible wild men with red eyes and of enormous height, completely covered with long hair.
Their tremendous size was attested to by the 3-foot-long human-like footprints that they left in their wake, as well as their alleged ability to tear entire birch trees from the earth with their bare hands, roots and all. Similarly, Philip Godsell, who spent much time around the campfires of the Slavey and Casca during his years as an inspector for the Hudson's Bay Company, described the Nakani as
troglodytes, twice the size of ordinary humans, who went about naked save for a coating of evil-smelling hair.
In some articles, he likened them to gorillas and gargoyles, and commented upon the superhuman strength and speed they were said to possess. Many frontiersmen wrote about the incredible size of these creatures' footprints, which they left behind in the snow and muskeg. Their tracks were purportedly man-like in appearance, yet much longer and narrower. In some accounts, their big toe stood out from the remaining 4. Although their footprints never bore any nail marks, some said that the Nakani's fingers were tipped with long, nail-like claws. By the mid-20th century, the image of the Nakani as an enormous hairy monster was making its way into books and popular magazines, often in dramatic fashion. For example, an article entitled Cursed Treasure of Dead Man's Valley, published in the June 1968 issue of the magazine Saga, maintained that the Nakani were
hairy demons who stand as high as a Kodiak bear. are as swift as a bird in flight, and kill all things they reach by cutting off their heads. Their skin is so tough that a bullet will not penetrate it, and cutting it with a knife is more difficult than cutting stone.
The Casca, Slavey, and Mountain Indians of Mackenzie Country long maintained that the Nahanni Valley was the domain of the Nakani, and that these fearsome monsters resided within its foreboding caves and canyons. This belief is attested to by the region's toponymy. According to Dene language expert Alan Adam, Nahadi, an old native word for the South Nahanni River, means River of Giants. The Nakani were by no means confined to these remote mountain hideaways. Many of these monsters tirelessly traversed the subarctic forests in search of prey, often traveling extraordinarily long distances without stopping for food or rest, usually alone. Natives all over the Northland, from the coastal regions of Alaska to the forests of the Yukon, lived in almost perpetual fear of them. Nakani attacks occurred almost exclusively during the spring, summer, and early autumn. The subarctic winter, on the other hand, though dark, miserable, and bitterly cold, was mercifully devoid of these dreaded encounters. Where the Nakani retreated to during the winter months was a mystery to the Dene. Some said that they retired to carefully concealed burrows that they dug from the permafrost, where they spent the winter hibernating like bears. Others claimed that they migrated south to a place where their kind were more numerous. Like the Nahanni Indians, the Nakani have been blamed for the unusual number of mysterious deaths and disappearances that have plagued Nahanni country since the days of Willie and Frank McLeod. Legend has it that these monsters did their grisly work at night, prowling about the river valley in the dark and quietly dispatching any campers they happened to encounter, perhaps tearing, twisting, or hacking their victims' heads from their shoulders. Outside the Mackenzie Mountains, the Nakani hunted traveling Indians, stalking them from concealment in the brush. Oftentimes, a Nakani's intended victims only became aware of its presence when one of their number, perhaps a scout on reconnaissance duty, stumbled upon its strange tracks in the forest, or caught a glimpse of its dark figure out of the corner of his eye, darting noiselessly into the bush. In other instances, the uncanny feeling of being watched might serve as sufficient proof that a Nakani was somewhere nearby. When a Nakani targeted a particular camp, it took up residence in the trees just beyond the light of the campfire and waited. Sometimes it taunted its intended victims by throwing rocks and sticks at them. It also, on occasion, emitted strange whistling sounds, or noises resembling human laughter. Often it would slip into camp in the middle of the night and steal food, typically fish, either from drying racks or smokehouses, or destroy fish nets and other equipment. Legend has it that the purpose of the Nakani's visits were twofold. Its primary objective was stealing women. Girls who strayed too far from the camp, especially at dawn or dusk, were in serious danger of being abducted and dragged away into the woods, never to be seen again. The other motivation that drew these monsters to Dene camps was sustenance. If afforded the opportunity, Nakani would snatch children and lone hunters and carry them off into the woods, where it would devour them. On rare occasions, intended victims, most often young women, narrowly escaped the Nakani's clutches and returned to tell the tale. Those who survived such encounters often described a powerful, nauseating odor which preceded the attack. Others reported being beset by an overwhelming, almost petrifying sense of dread, as if the Nakani had exercised some sort of hypnotic power over them. Frontiersmen weren't the only white men to document the Nakani phenomenon. Another category of Caucasian to write about these subarctic wildmen were ethnologists and anthropologists, professional academics who included the tale in their peer-reviewed articles on Dene culture and beliefs. Interestingly, the majority of these scholars extracted an entirely different version of the Nakani legend from the Indians whom they interviewed. In this version, the Nakani are not huge, hairy hominids, but rather strange-looking, bedraggled Indians. Most academics who wrote on the subject agreed that the Nakani, according to their Dene informants, were Indians who became wild after engaging in murder or cannibalism. As a result of their hard life in the bush and their separation from society, they acquired a frightening, grotesque appearance. Their faces were gaunt and their bodies emaciated on account of malnutrition. Their skin was often caked with filth and grease, their hair unkempt, and their clothing worn and ragged. Oftentimes, their outfits were strange or incomplete. One knife-wielding Nakani, for example, was said to have been seen wearing nothing more than hard-soled shoes made from untanned hides and a headscarf. Others were purported to wear strange boots which could not be purchased at any trading post in the region. Although the Nakani described by academics were literally wild men bereft of civilization, some of the attributes with which they were ascribed were distinctly inhuman. For example, although Osgood described the Nakani as, quote, a human being, generally an Indian, dressed either in the fashion of an Indian or a white man, unquote, he also maintained that it wore, quote, tremendously large boots, which are noted by the tracks he leaves in the mud, unquote. Tracks evocative of the long, narrow footprints left by the hairy giant of frontier legend. In a similar vein, anthropologist Richard K. Nelson wrote that the Koyukon Indians of the Yukon River Valley described the Nakani as being among the large animals, a creature that was neither man nor beast, but something in between. Most academics dismissed these inhuman qualities as inevitable distortions added by Dene storytellers who hoped to make their tales more interesting to the listener. The Nakani, they firmly maintained, was nothing more than a man, or in rare occasions a woman, who became separated from society either having been banished for some crime he committed, or isolated through some tragedy such as starvation or revenge warfare, which claimed the lives of everyone else in his band. The Dene were afraid of these wild Indians because they considered them crazy and unpredictable, well aware of the deleterious effect of extreme isolation on one's mental state. Many of those who have written on the subject have concluded that the Nakani was a boogeyman who served to dissuade women, children, and lone hunters from wandering too far from the safety of the camp. These people maintain that the Nakani legend is probably a relic of bygone times, when the Dene tribes of the Canadian North were in a state of total warfare with one another. During those days, Dene raiding parties would stealthily approach their enemies' camps during the night, and, hiding in the brush, would steal any women and children they found alone on the outskirts. As Poole Field put it in one of his letters,
in trying to run the stories down and by careful investigation, I had finally come to the conclusion that it originated from the old days, when practically all the Indians at one time or another used to make raids on each other, and would take anything of value found in the camp conquered, killing the men and taking any women or young girls or boys back to their own camp. After Dawson was struck and the civilized portion of the country became policed, it was given up, but still some of the younger men and also some of the older ones would take hunting trips into the country that was claimed by other tribes, and while doing this they would hang around any Indian camp at night. In some case they would capture a young girl that some of them had taken a fancy to, and take her back to their own tribe. Each tribe, if the occasion just came right, would give a foreign tribe a good scare anyway, even if they didn't do any worse. In the tribe that I was traveling with, there was a grandmother that had been stolen as a girl from the Paleys, and another from the Lushoot tribe at Peel River, and I know several on the Paley at the time of which I write.
Some believed that the Nakani legend specifically derived from warfare between Dene tribes and the more southerly Cree, who, equipped with HPC muskets that were far superior to traditional Dene weapons, invaded the North Country in the late 1700s, pressured by their fur-trading rivals to the south. One of the most intriguing theories regarding the nature of the Nakani is that this figure is a cryptid, or hidden animal, specifically a species of great ape endemic to North America. Some cryptozoologists, as experts in the study of hidden animals are known, suggest that the Nakani might be the same species as the Sasquatch, another suspected North American hominid. Some have theorized that it is a remnant Neanderthal or Denisovan, archaic humans generally believed to have gone extinct about 40,000 years ago. Others believe that it might be a relative of Gigantopithecus, an enormous, possibly bipedal ape that disappeared from the jungles of Southeast Asia around 100,000 years ago. Others still hypothesize that the Nakani is an entirely new species of hominid, which has yet to be accepted by the scientific community. Homo sapiens, or modern humans, are the only species of great ape widely believed to have migrated to the Americas in ancient times. If archaic humans or some other variety of great ape really traveled to the Americas in prehistoric times, how did they do it? Most anthropologists believe that the first humans to arrive in the Americas traveled from Siberia to Alaska via an ancient bridge of land and ice. The first of these nomads are believed to have followed large game herds across the Bering Strait around 13,000 years ago, near the end of the last ice age. At that time, North America was dominated by two great glaciers, the Western Cordilleran Ice Sheet and the Easterly Laurentian Ice Sheet, which met at a point just east of the Rocky Mountains. During an event known as the Wisconsin Glacial Epoch, these glaciers began to melt, opening up a longitudinal passage that ran down the length of the continent. Seeking greener pastures, many of the nomads followed this passage south. Their descendants multiplied and scattered across North and South America, forming the various nations whose members are collectively known today as Amerindians. Is it possible that other less advanced hominids, perhaps the ancestors of the Sasquatch or the Nakani, also crossed from Siberia to the Americas via Beringia? Fossil evidence clearly indicates that both Neanderthals and Denisovans inhabited Northeast Asia around the same time as Homo sapiens. And, intriguingly, Russian folklore contends that the Altai Mountains of Central Asia and the boreal forests of Siberia are home to hairy subhumans eerily evocative of North American wildmen, known respectively as the Almas and the Chichunya. Although most scientists believe that human beings were the only hominids to make their way to the New World prior to the Age of Exploration, a tantalizing archaeological discovery made near the Gwich'in village of Old Crow, Yukon, in the late 1970s indicates that the Canadian North was occupied by intelligent, tool-wielding animals at least 12,000 years before the first Paleo-Indians set foot on Alaskan soil. In the Bluefish Caves, located about 110 miles from the shores of the Arctic Ocean, anthropologist Jacques St. Mars discovered a mammoth bone which appeared to have been fashioned into a caribou fleshing tool around 20,000 BC. More recently, some archaeologists have argued that a mastodon bone unearthed near San Diego, USA, during a routine highway excavation in the early 1990s, coupled with a handful of primitive stone tools discovered nearby, constitutes proof that some sort of intelligent hominid lived in the Americas as early as 130,000 BC. The bone in question bore spiral fractures which indicated that someone, or something, had smashed it with a rock when it was still fresh, presumably in an attempt to gain access to the nutritious marrow within. Flat cobblestones and round stones discovered nearby bore markings which implied their employment as primitive hammers and anvils. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence supporting the notion that the Nakani are real flesh-and-blood cryptids is the fact that they share a number of peculiar attributes with other supposed wildmen from all over the world. For example, 19th century slavey trappers, whose only connection with the outside was through a handful of missionaries and the HBC traders with whom they haggled, claimed that the Nakani made whistling calls, left behind huge footprints, had a penchant for stone throwing, and emitted a putrid odor somewhat akin to the smell of rotten flesh, characteristics which the Coast Salish of the Fraser Delta ascribed to the Sasquatch, and Aborigines of the Australian outback to their own wild man, the Yowie. Harrowing stories of encounters with the Nakani have been a staple of Dene campfire conversations for countless generations. Unfortunately, most of these tales have long since been lost to history, as is so often the case with oral lore. One old Dene story which survived to the present day, recorded as it was in 1964 by northern folklorist Charles J. Kime, tells of Nakani which haunted the woods surrounding Old Crow, Yukon, not far from the Bluefish Caves. According to this narrative, a young girl tasked with gathering spruce branches for her bed wandered a little too far from the camp. The Nakani, who had been watching her from concealment in the trees, quote, snatched the girl and took her back to his cave, unquote. There, he bound her hands with babiche and tethered her to a tree stump situated just outside the cave's mouth so that she could not escape. After spending several days outside the Nakani's lair, the girl asked the wild man to give her some privacy. The monster obliged and turned his back while she moved behind the tree stump, contenting himself with holding one end of her tether in his hand. Somehow, the girl managed to free herself from her bonds when the Nakani was not looking. She stripped naked, dressed the stump with her clothes and bonnet, tied her tether to the stump, and stealthily slipped away into the woods, homeward bound. When some time had elapsed, the Nakani, oblivious, called out to the girl to see if she still required privacy. When she failed to answer him, he tugged on her tether and was surprised to find that he could not move her. The wild man began to sing a love song and moved towards what he thought was his prisoner, dancing as he went. What a surprise he had, wrote Kime, when he leapt and hugged a stump. In the 2007 book, The History and Stories of the Gwich'in, Eliza Andre, a Gwich'in elder from the settlement of Tsigitchik, Northwest Territories, located at the confluence of the Mackenzie and Arctic Red Rivers, related an old local story involving a Nakani. Once, an old woman and her grandson went out into the bush to snare rabbits. One day, when they were inspecting their traps, the grandson stopped dead in his tracks. "Grandmother," he said, "I hear something." "What do you hear?" the old woman asked. "Back past our trail, someone is making noise." The old woman listened very carefully until she too heard the sound. Immediately, she stuffed the rabbit she had snared into a bundle, threw the bundle over her shoulder, and set out for camp as fast as she could, urging her grandson to follow quickly. When the pair finally reached their tent, the old woman promptly built a fire, hastily skinned the rabbits, and threw their intestines onto the burning wood. Slowly, the intestines began to sizzle. By this time, wrote Andre, they could both hear someone making noise outside their camp. Someone was approaching their camp, drawing nearer and nearer, unquote. In preparation for their encounter with what could only be a Nakani, the old woman gathered the hot intestines and crouched by the door of the tent, waiting. Sure enough, the intruder, who was indeed a Nakani, poked his head through the tent opening. His ravenous eyes fell upon the old woman and her grandson. Immediately, the old woman slapped the creature in the face with the hot intestines. The Nakani howled in pain and surprise and reeled back from the tent, clutching his scalded face. With a heavy thump, he landed on the ground and lay still. The following morning, Andre continued, they went out to investigate the incident of the previous night. They found a big bushman stretched outside their camp. They did not bother to do anything to him, but instead retired to their tent, never to be bothered again for a long, long time. It is possible that the first white men to have a brush with the Nakani were HBC engagé John MacLeod and his crew during their expedition up the west branch of the Liard River in the summer of 1831. One night, while resting by the fire after a long day of trekking and portaging, the voyageurs were harassed by an unseen assailant who hurled stones at them from the shadows. Although MacLeod speculated that this marauder was probably a Nahanni Indian, native legend suggests that this stone-throwing provocateur, considering his behavior, may have been a Nakani. In his 2002 book, Mysterious Creatures, A Guide to Cryptozoology, author George M. Aberhart related a Nakani encounter had by a native named Paul Peters in August 1960. While at his fishing camp, located 10 miles down the Yukon River from Ruby, Alaska, Peters watched a Nakani make its way along a rocky beach towards his dogs, quote, which were whining and acting strange, unquote. The creature was broad-shouldered and very muscular, and walked on 2 legs like a man. It was covered in black hair, and was about 6 foot 6 inches tall. Suddenly, perhaps frightened by the dogs, the Nakani altered its course, climbed a steep hill overlooking the river, and disappeared into the bush. Far from being obsolete phenomena relegated to the 19th and 20th centuries, Nakani sightings still occur with casual frequency in the wilderness of northern Canada and Alaska. On July 28, 2016, for example, the CBC published an article describing a Nakani encounter reported by Tony Willia, a Dog-Rib native from the settlement of Wati, Northwest Territories. Earlier that month, while boating from his hometown to the northern tip of Lac La Marte, Willia spied a plastic bag bobbing in the water. Hoping to retrieve the object, he pulled his boat alongside it. While he reached down to grab the bag, a rogue wave tipped his boat over, and Willia found himself immersed in freezing water. After struggling in vain to right his vessel and climb back inside, he decided to swim for the nearest island. Hampered though he was by his waterlogged clothing, he managed to reach the island and crawl onto its rocky shore, exhausted and chilled to the bone. All of a sudden, Willia told the CBC, there was a big man standing beside me. He must have walked away, because I heard some branches break through the bushes. I packed up my clothes in a white bag and readied myself to leave. And leave he did, though not before spending a terrifying 48 hours alone on the beach, certain that the isle's mysterious resident was watching him from concealment. On July 19, 2016, Willia was rescued by an RCMP and Canadian military search party and taken to the Stanton Territorial Hospital in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, where he made a full recovery. He later claimed that he never slept a wink throughout the entire ordeal. One blogger who commented upon Willia's experience suggested that the Dog Ribs Nakani sighting may have been a case of what has been called third man syndrome, a phenomenon reported by explorers, outdoor athletes, and disaster survivors in which a mysterious guardian angel-like figure appears in times of extreme difficulty to offer comfort and assistance. Intriguing though it may be, this explanation cannot account for another potential Nakani sighting reported in the fall of 2012 by two Inuit women from Quebec's northern Nunavik region. While picking berries near the village of Akulavik, Maggie Cruikshank Kingalik and her friend spotted a strange creature out on the tundra. Initially, the two ladies thought that the figure was another berry picker. As it got closer, however, they realized that it was covered in long dark hair.
"We weren't sure what it was at first,"
said Kingalik in an interview.
"It is not a human being. It was really tall and kept coming towards our direction, and we could tell it was not a human."
Kingalik estimated that the creature was around 3 meters or 9 feet 10 inches tall. Its footprints were later found to be 40 centimeters or 15.7 inches long. Over the years, hundreds of Wildman sightings have been reported on the Pacific coast of Alaska, the historic homeland of the Tlingit Indians. Although dozens of eyewitnesses in these various reports referred to the figure they encountered as a bushman, evoking the Nakani of Dene lore, some of the descriptions they furnished correspond more closely with a classic portrait of a Sasquatch, a supposed ape man whose coastal range, some believe, extends from California to as far north as St. Michael, Alaska. Indeed, the Nakani is not the only wild man said to inhabit the North Country. As Pierre Burton put it in his 1956 book, The Mysterious North, quote, "The Mahoney, who flit through the Peel River country in the northern Yukon, are enormous hairy giants with red eyes, who eat human flesh and devour entire birch trees at a gulp. The predatory Sasquatches of British Columbia's mountain caves are 8 feet tall and covered with black woolly hair from head to foot. There are others, all akin to these. The terrible brushman of the Low Show in the upper Mackenzie, with his black face and yellow eyes, preying on women and children. The Weedigo of the Barrens, that horrible naked cannibal, his face black with frostbite, his lips eaten away to expose his fang-like teeth. The 8-foot head-hunting mountain men of the Nahanni. And those imaginary beings of Great Slave Lake, whom the Dog Rib Indians simply call the enemy, and fear so greatly that they must always build their homes on islands, safe from the shoreline where the enemy roam." It is likely that a portion of Pierre Burton's succinct summary of the various wild men of the Northland derives from Michael H. Mason's aforementioned chapter in The Arctic Forests. Mason began this chapter, which more broadly details the superstitions of the Dene Indians, by stating, quote, "It is no easy task to write on the habits and philosophy of these most interesting and attractive people, for their most outstanding characteristic is general inconsistency." After detailing the spiritual philosophy of the 20th century Dene, which he characterizes as a blend of traditional animistic beliefs and missionary-introduced Christianity, Mason went on to describe the human-like monsters in which these people very much believed. Chief among the devils of the Gwich'in, wrote Mason, is the Tinje Rui, or Brushman. He is very tall and thin, with a black face and yellow eyes, unquote. Although some authors have lumped the Tinje Rui in with the Nakani, Mason claimed that the Gwich'in made a distinction between this creature and the Mahoney, another name for the Nakani, and that they were far more terrified of the latter. Later on in this chapter, Mason briefly described a hostile, invisible wild man called the Na-in, of whom, quote, "many old men living today are afraid." According to Mason, when a branch broke from a tree and landed on someone, some old Dene man would blame the incident on this mysterious creature. No chapter on the wild men of the North would be complete without a nod to the Kushtaka, the notorious land otter man of Tlingit folklore.
the Tsimshian of Prince Rupert and Terrace, BC, the Haida of the Queen Charlotte Islands, and the Nootka of Western Vancouver Island, all have their own versions of this treacherous, semi-supernatural denizen of the Pacific Northwest. According to Northwest Coast tradition, Kushtaka are small shapeshifters which can take the form of otters, humans, and human-sized ottermen. Considered to be evil tricksters, they are said to prey on those who have drowned or become lost in the woods. Sometimes these creatures save their victims before stealing their souls. On other occasions, they viciously rake at their victims with their sharp claws. Much like the Nakani and the Sasquatch, the Kushtaka is said to emit a high-pitched whistle, alternating from low to high. In 1953, a mysterious book entitled The Strangest Story Ever Told was privately published in New York under the name Harry D. Culp. The book's preface stated that the author had been dead for several years, but that the manuscript he put together was edited and submitted for publication by his daughter Virginia. This story, ostensibly based on true events, describes a race of hairy wild men whom some believe might be the Kushtaka. The book is divided into 7 chapters, each of them revolving around a particular stretch of wilderness inland of Thomas Bay, a small inlet situated northwest of Wrangell, Alaska, not too far from the mouth of the Stickeen River. Locals sometimes refer to Thomas Bay as the Bay of Death on account of a massive landslide which swept through it in 1750, wiping out an entire Tlingit village and killing over 500 of its inhabitants. In the first chapter, the narrator claimed that he was one among 4 bankrupt prospectors who shared a cabin at Wrangell, Alaska in the early 20th century. In the spring of 1900, one of the 4 returned to the cabin with the happy news that he had met an Indian with a chunk of gold-bearing quartz in his possession, and that the Indian had given him directions to the place where he had found it. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay, the prospector informed his partners, and camp on Patterson River on the right side, travel upriver for about 8 miles, and then turn to the high mountains, and after traveling about 1.5 miles, I would find a lake shaped like a half moon. It was there that the Indian claimed to have found his prize. The prospectors decided to pool their money together and secure an outfit for Charlie, the man who had returned home with the good news. Charlie was to head into the wilderness beyond Thomas Bay and see if there was any truth to the Indian's tale. That May, Charlie set out for the northerly diggings. In the meantime, the narrator and the other 2 partners found work in a sawmill and began to save up money for a grubstake in the hope that Charlie's preliminary expedition would prove fruitful. Things went along until the first part of June, Culp wrote, when, on a Sunday in the late afternoon, we all being home, and in walks Charlie without a coat or hat, and looking as if he'd been through hell. He didn't give us any greeting whatever, just heaved a piece of quartz over into a corner of the room and said, "Get me something to eat. I'm all in and want to rest." The fellow looked it, and, after he had eaten, he turned in without telling us a thing about his trip. The quartz piece that Charlie brought home was heavily streaked with gold, much to his partner's delight. Despite the unbridled enthusiasm that took hold of his colleagues, convinced as they were that they were now on the verge of a major strike, Charlie spent the next few days acting very strangely. He seldom spoke, refusing to answer his partner's many questions, and occupied himself with hard manual labor from dawn to dusk. Finally, Charlie returned to the cabin one day and asked his partners to lend him enough money for a steamboat ticket to Seattle. He was finished with Alaska, he said, and wanted to leave the North Country for good. He agreed to tell his partners about his experience in Thomas Bay, but only if they promised to never remind him of it again. When the prospectors agreed to his condition, Charlie told him his story. Charlie had reached the shore of Thomas Bay 4 days after his departure and proceeded up Patterson River, as the Indian had instructed him. He searched everywhere for the lake shaped like a half moon, but only succeeded in locating one in the shape of the letter S. The area surrounding the lake was curiously lifeless, devoid of even the smallest game. Charlie was beginning to grow weary of the simple frontier fare he had brought with him from Wrangell, namely beans, rice, and bacon, and decided to hike over to a ridge about 8 miles east of the lake, where he had heard some grouse hooting. Sure enough, Charlie found a few ptarmigan there and began to hunt them. In doing so, he stumbled upon a ledge of quartz, liberally streaked with gold. As he did not have a pickaxe with him, he used the butt end of his rifle to break a chunk off the rock, destroying the wooden stalk in the process. The disappointment that Charlie felt over the loss of his rifle was overshadowed by the elation that his discovery elicited. He thrilled at the prospect of returning to the site with his partners and striking it rich. After concealing the quartz ledge with moss and detritus, Charlie climbed to the top of the ridge in order to scout for landmarks by which he might relocate his discovery. "Right there, fellows," he told his partners, "I got the scare of my life. I hope to God I never see or go through the likes of it again." Swarming up the ridge toward me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor monkeys, yet looked like both. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where the scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first to get me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and bodies made me faint. Abandoning his broken gun, Charlie fled for the sea, with the creatures in hot pursuit. He felt their hot breath on his neck and their sharp claw-like nails scratching at his back. Reason abandoned him, and later that night, Charlie found himself adrift in his boat with no clear memory of how he managed to get there. Cold, hungry, and crazy for a drink of water, he started for Wrangell with his piece of gold-streaked quartz. The following 5 chapters of The Strangest Story Ever Told relate the misadventures of Kolp, his other prospecting partners, and 3 frontiersmen of Norwegian, Russian, and Japanese descent who all went into Thomas Bay country for one reason or another. Aside from the location in which they take place, these stories are united by, as cryptozoology pioneer Ivan T. Sanderson put it in his commentary on the book, quote, "a thread of reference to hairy, stinking humanoids," unquote, as well as the temporary insanity which their, quote, "overpowering and nauseating stink," unquote, appeared to induce in all who encountered them. This is not just a commonplace, Sanderson continued, but now an almost invariable concomitant to all reports made by persons all over the world who say they have been in close proximity to one of these creatures, unquote. The 7th and final chapter of The Strangest Story Ever Told describes the experience of a frontiersman who established a trapline in the wilderness beyond Thomas Bay. When inspecting his traps, he found that they had all been sprung by a creature which left behind strange footprints, the likes of which he had never seen before. Sometimes the animal walked on 4 legs. At other times, it walked on only 2. The trapper described the animal's hind tracks as, quote, about 7 inches long and looked as if they were a cross between a 2-year-old bear's and a small barefooted man's tracks. You could see claw marks at the ends of the toes, toe pads, and heavy heel marks. Between the toe pad marks and the heel marks was a sort of space where the foot did not bear so heavily on the ground, as if the foot were slightly hollowed or had an instep. The front set looked like a big raccoon's tracks, only larger. After his dog was abducted and presumably eaten by the strange creature, the trapper returned to civilization, where he related his story to Kolp. He eventually overcame his fear of the mysterious animal and returned to his trapline in Thomas Bay country. The trapper was never seen again. Some of those who have speculated on the nature of the mysterious devils of Thomas Bay have suggested that they might be Kushtaka, perhaps flesh and blood animals unknown to science, or the transmogrified souls of the Tlingit who perished there in 1750. Based on 2 separate incidents reported in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the author of this book has decided to include another Alaskan monster in this list of northern wildmen, which one U.S. Army officer styled the Glacial Demon. The first incident took place in 1898 during the Klondike Gold Rush. At that time, rumor had it that an old Russian trail led from the shores of Prince William Sound, an Alaskan inlet situated in the shadow of the vast Valdez Glacier, located about 185 kilometers or 115 miles due east of Anchorage, Alaska, to the Yukon goldfields, circumventing Canadian customs. Eager to avoid paying duty on their outfits at the Canadian border, about 3,500 American stampeders disembarked at this remote part of Alaska and set out in search of the trailhead.
As it turned out, there was no secret Russian route to the interior. The only way through the coast mountains in that part of Alaska was over the Valdez Glacier. Prospectors who chose this route had to haul their supplies over 300 yards of sand and 6 miles of snow to reach the base of the glacier. After that, they had to ascend the icy monolith, hoisting their sleds up with pulleys. Upon reaching the windy, frozen summit of the Valdez Glacier, stampeders ventured out onto the ice fields one by one. With steel crampons strapped to their feet, they slowly inched their way northwest, picking their way through a minefield of deadly crevasses. It would be several weeks before any of them reached the other side, where an even more dangerous obstacle, the Clutina River, awaited them. Some of the gold seekers who hazarded this so-called all-American route to the Klondike were buried in avalanches. Their bones still lie trapped beneath the snow. Other unfortunates plunged through thin ice and plummeted to their doom, disappearing down bottomless black crevasses. Those who avoided these fates faced a myriad of physical and mental tribulations on their journey over the glacial plain, enduring extreme exposure, severe sleep deprivation, and countless hours immersed in an unearthly white fog. They did most of their traveling at night, when the ice was solid enough to bear their weight. In the day, when they weren't trying to sleep, the sun reflected off the snow and ice, causing many prospectors to go snowblind. Due to the harsh conditions, stampeders were unable to thoroughly cook their food, and many survived their journey over the Valdez Glacier by subsisting on half-frozen, half-cooked meals. Many who failed to turn back, too stubborn to abandon their folly, slowly descended into insanity. In the spring of 1899, a man named W.R. Abercrombie, a captain in the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Regiment, was dispatched to the Valdez area in order to report his findings to the War Department. That April, the officer reached Port Valdez, a town that had since sprang up on the shores of Prince William Sound, the site of present-day Valdez, Alaska, where he encountered a ragged band of stampeders suffering from snowblindness, scurvy, and frostbite. These prospectors had just returned from the ice field. After interviewing them, Abercrombie made the following entry in his report, quote, "I noticed in talking to these people that over 70% of them were more or less mentally deranged. My attention was first directed to this fact by their reference to a glacial demon. One big, raw-boned Swede in particular described to me how this demon had strangled his son on the glacier, his story being that he had just started from 12 Mile Point, a collection of huts just across the coast range of mountains from Valdez, with his son to go to the coast in company with some other prospectors. When halfway up the summit of the glacier, his son, who was ahead of him hauling a sled, while he was pushing behind, called to him, saying that this demon had attacked him and had his arms around his neck. The father ran to the son's assistance, but as he described it, his son being very strong, soon drove the demon away, and they passed on their way up toward the summit of the Valdez Glacier. The weather was very cold, and the wind blowing very hard, so that it made traveling very difficult in passing over the ice between the huge crevasses through which it was necessary to pick their way to gain the summit. While in the thickest of these crevasses, the demon again appeared. He was said to be a small, heavily built man, and very active. He again sprang on the son's shoulders, this time with such a grasp that, although the father did all he could to release him, the demon finally strangled the son to death. The old man then put the son on a sled and brought him down to 12 Mile Camp, where the other prospectors helped bury him. During the recital of this tale, the old man's eyes would glaze, and he would go through all the actions to illustrate how he fought off the imaginary demon. When I heard this story, there were some 10 or 12 other men in the cabin, and at the time, it would not have been safe to dispute the theory of the existence of this demon on the Valdez Glacier, as every man in there firmly believed it to be a reality. Although Captain W.R. Abercrombie suspected that the glacial demon described by the Swedish stampeder was nothing more than a delusion brought on by scurvy, a fascinating article written by a prospector named Frank E. Howard, which appeared in the March 1909 issue of the Alaska Yukon magazine, suggests that there may have been some truth to his tale. In the article, Howard described an incident which took place during a prospecting trip that he made in the early 1900s. While camping alone off the shores of Yakutat Bay, located on the Alaskan coast roughly halfway between Port Valdez and Juneau, Howard decided to explore the nearby Malaspina Glacier, the largest Piedmont glacier in the world. Howard ascended the glacier through a crack in the ice and began to make his way over to a distant ridge. On the way, he lost his footing and slid into an open crevasse. Although he did not sustain any major injuries from the fall, which found him wedged between the fissure's narrow walls, Howard was unable to climb out of the slippery chasm and decided to follow it deeper into the ice, hoping that it would lead out into the bay. As I kept going ahead, Howard wrote, I noticed a gradual increase of light, and in a few more steps, I stood in a broad wall of blue light that came down from above, and looking up, I saw there was no clear opening to the surface, but objects were now revealed some distance around. Then, an object rose slowly out of the glimmer and took form, a spectral thing with giant form and lifelike movement. The object rose erect, a Goliath in the shape of a man. This glacial being had a small head, narrow shoulders, and abnormally wide hips. It growled a challenge, and suddenly Howard was, quote, engulfed in a rank, indescribable odor, unquote. Petrified, the prospector desperately searched for an escape route, the hairs of his neck standing on end. Before he could make a move, however, the creature slinked away, eyeing him, quote, with a slantwise glance, as it vanished into the gloom. His heart hammering in his chest, Howard continued deeper into the crevasse and found an exit about 50 feet away, which opened up onto a timbered beach. Since my miraculous encounter and escape, he wrote, I often attempt to solve the mystery that still enshrouds the apparition of the glacier. Terror might have magnified my imagination, but the apparition was not the imagination of an overbalanced mind. I am thoroughly convinced I saw something. It was not like any animal I had ever seen before. The Inuit of the far north, from Alaska to the Arctic archipelago to Greenland, have legends about a race of primitive giants, at least twice the size of regular men, who once inhabited the lands they occupy today. They called this ancient people Tunajuk, a word with etymological ties to Tornat, an Inuktitut word denoting helpful spirits, mentioned briefly in the chapter on the evil spirit of the Nakani Valley. Physically, the Tunajuk were said to be immensely powerful, and could easily carry full-grown bearded seals on their backs. They did not live in igloos like the Inuit, but rather in circular stone pit houses roofed with whale ribs and animal skins. A simple people, the Tunajuk were said to practice a number of revolting customs. They did not usually cook their meat and preferred to eat it rotten. Tunajuk women would sometimes sit with raw meat tucked between their thighs and belly, in the hope that their body heat would hasten the decomposition process. As they did not know how to cure animal skins, bits of rotten meat and rancid fat dangled from the insides of their robes. Sometimes, the Tunajuk would sew their young warriors into maggot-infested seal skins, believing that this would somehow enhance their skills as warriors. Although the Tunajuk are said to have fought bitterly with one another, they rarely showed aggression toward the Inuit, and seemed to be deathly afraid of their dogs. In addition to their martial prowess, they were excellent hunters, who could summon game with their voices. Eventually, the Inuit began to hunt down the Tunajuk, and in time, greatly reduced their number. The giants who survived these predations fled to the mountains of the interior, where, some say, their descendants still linger to this very day. Some suspect that the legend of the Tunajuk derives from interactions between the Thule, or Proto-Inuit, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, and their prehistoric counterparts, the more ancient Dorset people. The ancestors of the Dorset are believed to have arrived in the Canadian Arctic around 3200 BC. When the Thule people spread west from the Bering Strait and onto Dorset territory in the 12th century AD, the Dorset were dying out, unable to cope with the climate change which characterized the medieval warm period. By 1500 AD, the Dorset are believed to have vanished completely. In 1955, American writer Kathleen Sherman and a handful of scientists visited Bylot Island, a polar isle situated just north of Baffin Island, Baffin Island being the largest of its kind in the Arctic archipelago. It was on this island, the Inuit maintained, that a band of Tunajuk once lived in ancient times. Sherman, who described the experience in her 1956 book Spring on an Arctic Island, reported finding a cluster of circular mounds, which proved to be large stones half buried in the permafrost. Some scientists among the group found whale bones and other stones in the vicinity of the structures, and concluded that these large stones had once served as the foundations of crude houses, dwellings evocative of the stone pit houses of the Tunajuk. Sherman and her companions were baffled as to how the ancient builders of these structures managed to haul the huge foundation stones, which were not of local origin, from their source. An Algonquian legend which made its way to the North Country from the Great Lakes region by way of the Cree, the story of the Wendigo, or Weedigo, is another northern tale containing Wildman elements. According to some interpretations of the legend, the Wendigo is a ravenous man-eating giant, which roams the northern forests in search of human flesh. Ojibwa storyteller Basil H. Johnston included a colorful description of this corporeal version of the Wendigo in The Manitou, his masterwork published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press in 2001. The Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into the sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. Unclean and suffering from suppurations of the flesh, the Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. Another version of the Wendigo legend has it that this entity is not a physical creature, but rather a malevolent spirit associated with the north, the cold, and starvation. During the winter months, it roams throughout the wilderness in search of human hosts. Indians who engaged in cannibalism made themselves especially vulnerable to Wendigo possession. When a person became possessed by a Wendigo, they gradually developed an insatiable appetite for human flesh, which drove them to butcher and eat their fellow tribesmen, even when other food sources were readily available. Philip Godsell described this phenomenon in his introduction to the June 1946 issue of the Alberta Folklore Quarterly, saying, quote, "The Weedigo, I might explain, is an evil spirit that enters the body of a sick man, converting him, unless he is destroyed, into a cannibal, endangering the lives of every member of the band. Hardly a spring goes by, but some wandering band of nomad hunters becomes obsessed with the idea that there is one of these cannibal spirits haunting the outskirts of the camp, anxious to become domiciled within the person of some sick Indian." One famous case of suspected Wendigo possession occurred in central Alberta in 1878. That winter, a Plains Cree trapper named Swift Runner slaughtered, cooked, and devoured his wife and 6 children. When the Northwest Mounted Police arrested him for his crime, he claimed that he was possessed by the Wendigo and needed to be killed before he caused more damage. The Mounties acquiesced. After trying Swift Runner and finding him guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder, they hanged him at Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta in 1879. Another breed of northern wildman, with both physical and supernatural qualities, are the Neketzaltara, the demonic minions of the evil spirit, which the Dene believe to inhabit the Nahanni karstlands. According to Father Julius Jeddah, in his article on the superstitions of the Tena Indians, these beings were shadowy devils that sometimes invaded Dene camps in the middle of the night. When the presence of these beings was announced by shamans, quote, "A great excitement ensued, during which the whole village was upset, everyone losing his head from fright, and a fine occasion was offered to the sorcerers to do any mischief they pleased." Unquote. When a Neketzaltara adopts a physical form, it sometimes appears as a creature similar to a dragon or a whale. More often, however, it assumes the form of some sort of goblin. There are 8 different types of goblins into which the Neketzaltara can transform, 3 of which resemble wildmen. The first of these is the Nenela-in, a hairy, long-armed creature with claw-like nails, which invades camps at night and steals fish from drying racks. Although the appearance of a Nenela-in is considered a bad omen for adults, if the creature, quote, happens to stop near a sleeping child and pat its head, the child shall become a shaman. Another goblin into which the Neketzaltara can metamorphose is the Yesu, or ghastly wolf, a hairy, long-armed bipedal creature with lupin features, which Jetta likened to the French loup-garou, or werewolf. Finally, there are the Tsantarotana, or Men of the Rocks, a form of Nequetzaltara which Jetta described as, quote, a kind of wild men, but with all the agility of spirits, unquote. These monsters inhabited the valley of the Yukon River, and were notorious kidnappers and thieves. As was mentioned earlier in this chapter, hundreds of Sasquatch sightings have been reported over the years on the west coast of Alaska. Many eyewitness descriptions of this creature are disturbingly consistent, and, when considered as a whole, paint a vivid portrait of a hairy, human-like giant, which inhabits the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. The Sasquatches reported on the Alaskan coasts are usually very tall, extremely powerful, and tend to exude a terrible smell akin to rotten flesh or burning garbage. They appear to communicate with each other through grunts and whistles, and can sometimes be heard howling in the night. Most stories suggest that Sasquatches are friendly. Shy and reclusive, they tend to avoid human settlements. Although they may abduct people from time to time, they rarely harm them.
In the year 1498, during his third voyage to the New World, Italian navigator Christopher Columbus sailed beyond the Caribbean islands for the first time and moored his ships off the coast of what is now Venezuela. Suffering from a debilitating illness which rendered him nearly blind, he ordered his men to row to the shore in boats and erect a Christian cross. Upon returning from their mainland excursion, his captains reported that the mountain beyond the beach was swarming with gatos paules, or monkeys. Columbus's description of this minor adventure is the first non-indigenous written reference to New World monkeys, 5 long-tailed families of the order of primates endemic to South, Central, and Mesoamerica. As incredible as it sounds, most primatologists today believe that the first New World monkeys came to the eastern shores of South America from West Africa by sailing across the Atlantic Ocean on vegetation rafts, preceding Christopher Columbus's first transatlantic voyage by about 35 million years. These same experts also believe that the descendants of these seafaring simians, after taking up residence in nearly every corner of the southern half of the continent, never ventured further north in central Mexico, leaving most of North America perpetually bereft of their mischievous presence. Contrary to the scientific consensus, however, several obscure native legends, coupled with a spate of 20th century eyewitness accounts and a handful of enigmatic fossils, seem to indicate that a species of long-tailed monkey once abode, and may still abide, in the wilderness of North America. In this piece, we'll explore the eclectic assortment of evidence supporting the existence of this mysterious primate, a creature sometimes colloquially referred to as the devil monkey. New World monkeys are the only non-human primates universally supposed to be endemic to the Americas. These Occidental pongids are endowed with several unique characteristics which distinguish them from their Old World cousins. The noses of New World monkeys, for example, are generally broader and flatter than those of their Afro-Asiatic relatives, with nostrils that open on the sides of the nose instead of on the bottom. When compared with their African and Asian counterparts, New World monkeys are of small to medium build, ranging in size from the tiny pygmy marmoset, the smallest monkey in the world, to the 33-pound woolly spider monkey, the largest monkey in the Americas. Interestingly, several primates endemic to the New World, including howler monkeys, spider monkeys, and woolly monkeys, are capable of grasping tree branches and other objects with their tails, a useful feature which their Old World cousins lack. Since at least the days of Christopher Columbus, New World monkeys appear to have confined their haunts to the southern half of the continent, eschewing the harsher, more frigid climes of Canada and the United States in favor of the tropical rainforests of Brazil and Peru. Most primatologists agree that, by the time the Isthmus of Panama formed in the misty abyss of our geological past, connecting the great islands of North and South America for the first time in history, New World monkeys were so well adapted to their equatorial abodes that they had no practical reason to venture further north in the jungles of Mexico. Intriguingly, for at least 150 years, geologists and paleontologists have uncovered evidence indicating that a completely different, far more ancient assortment of primates may have inhabited the wilderness of Canada and the United States long before the African ancestors of the New World monkeys first set paw upon their botanical rafts. Since 1870, for example, fossils of a primitive, lemur-like primate called Notharctus have been unearthed in Wyoming and the American Southwest. Since the 1960s, fossils of another ancient lemur-like creature named Egmowichichala have been found in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Oregon, Egmowichichala being a Sioux Indian word meaning little catman. In 2008, the fossilized remains of a marmoset-like animal called Teilhardina, supposed to be the oldest primate yet discovered in North America, were unearthed in the state of Mississippi. And in 2016, the petrified bones of a member of the oldest known New World monkey species, Panamacebus, were discovered in northern Panama, at what would once have been the southern end of the island of North America. With the exception of the mysterious Panamacebus specimen, the fossils of every primate unearthed in North America appear to be more closely related to fossils found in Europe and northern Asia than with any derivative of Africa. This intriguing observation has led some scientists to propose that a whole variety of primates migrated from Asia to North America long before the first New World monkeys disembarked on the beaches of South America, making their transcontinental journey over an ancient land bridge connecting Kamchatka with Alaska, by which the ancestors of most Amerindians are believed to have migrated to the Americas. The idea that some sort of monkey once haunted the wilderness of North America echoes an ancient and little-known native legend endemic to the southern border of Alaska and Canada's Yukon Territory. This unnerving oral tradition appears to have its origins in the watershed of the Copper River, a remote valley tucked between the Wrangell, Chugach, and St. Elias mountains of southeastern Alaska, historically and currently inhabited by members of the Ahtna Nation. According to the Ahtna, vicious, long-tailed men once lived in the Mentasta Mountains of southeastern Alaska, and in caves along Tanada Creek and the Slana and Copper Rivers, north of the Wrangell Mountains. The Ahtna called these creatures Tseteni, a word which translates to the tailed ones, or monkey people. One version of this legend appears in the 1997 book In the Shadow of the Mountains by Copper River native John E. Smelker. Another rendition, told by Ahtna natives Fred and Katie John, appears in James Carey's 1984 book Tatla and Nen, The Headwaters People's Country. According to John Smelker's grandmother, Mary Smelker Wood, and an Ahtna native named Markle Pete, these tailed ones were kind of human-like. They walked on their hind legs, but they were hairy all over. They did not wear any clothes, and they had long tails. Fred and Katie John also described the Tseteni as being vaguely human-like in appearance. It had body hair, they said. There was no hair on its face. They say its face was like a man's. Its hands were like a man's hands. It had a long tail. They say that it was as big as a tall person. That is what I heard about it. Several hundred years ago, so the story goes, members of an Ahtna band who camped at the confluence of the Slana and Copper Rivers, at the site of present-day Slana, Alaska, began to mysteriously disappear. According to Reverend Arthur R. Wright, a half-Dene Episcopalian missionary who lived among the Ahtna in the early 1900s, whose version of the legend first appeared in the February 7, 1924 issue of the Cordova Daily News, the disappearances began shortly after a dog brought the fresh tail of a fish into camp. These ordinarily unremarkable remains aroused the curiosity of the Ahtna, as they were wholly engaged in hunting caribou at that time, and had not caught any fish that season. Suspecting that another band was encamped nearby, several Ahtna scouts headed up the Copper River towards its headwaters to locate their mysterious neighbors. They never returned from their excursion. More disappearances took place in the area throughout the ensuing months. The first Ahtna to vanish were children who strayed too far from camp. Next, women went missing on berry-picking excursions. Before long, elders began to disappear from their tents. Even grown men who dared to venture beyond the light of the campfire at night would vanish mere feet from camp, as if swallowed by the darkness. The disappearances increased to such an extent that the Atna feared that their entire band might be forced to abandon the country. One day, an Atna hunter who had been out in the bush raced back to camp, breathless with exertion and terror. He told his friends and family that he had seen a man-like creature with a long tail perched upon a particular fallen tree. One of the band's young warriors, whom legend describes as being especially courageous and intelligent, suspected that the tailed one his fellow tribesmen had seen in the woods was responsible for the mysterious disappearances that had plagued his people. He resolved to track the creature to its den and kill it. The young warrior followed his compatriot's trail to the downed timber and found a pair of strange tracks leading into the woods. He followed the paw prints to a hidden trail which cut through the forest and proceeded down this secret path. As he walked, he covered his own footprints with grass so that his pursuit would go unnoticed by any observant enemies who might enter the trail behind him. According to the version of the legend which Reverend Wright learned from his Atna friends, the brave came across several lengths of grass rope stretched across the trail, components of primitive traps which he managed to avoid springing. After following the tracks for some time, the brave came to what Fred and Katie John identified as a hill south of the present-day Alaskan village of Batsonetas, which sits on Tanada Creek just upriver from its junction with the Copper River, about 14 kilometers or 8.5 miles southeast of Slana. There, the warrior spied a handful of tailed men in the distance. According to Reverend Wright's version of the legend, the creatures used their tails to propel themselves, curling them between their legs and recoiling them in such a manner as to push themselves forward. Careful to avoid detection, the brave picked his way through the forest and placed himself windward of the creatures so that they would not pick up his scent. That accomplished, he climbed a tall tree and concealed himself within its upper branches. From his high perch, he had a clear view of the monkey people, whom he discerned were playing a game with some sort of ball, shrieking with hideous delight as they rolled the round object back and forth to each other. After watching the game for some time, the brave realized, with a thrill of horror and rage, that the ball with which the tailed ones were so gleefully playing was really the decapitated head of a young man who had recently disappeared from camp. No sooner had the warrior made this appalling observation than it began to rain. Appearing to dislike the water, the tailed ones abandoned their sport and headed further up the trail. The young man scrambled down the tree and followed them, prudently maintaining a safe distance. Eventually, the monkey people came to a cliff, which ran along the banks of the Copper River. Near the top of the escarpment were 8 caves, each of them sufficiently wide to accommodate an adult human. One by one, the Tseteni climbed up the cliff and disappeared into the caverns. Certain that he had discovered the den of the creatures who had been killing his people, the young man ran back to camp and informed his fellow tribesmen of this new intelligence. With the disappearances of their loved ones fresh in their memories, the Atna unanimously agreed to rid themselves of their tailed tormentors as soon as they could. Considering the undeniable craftiness of the monkey men, they knew that the only way to achieve this end would be to completely annihilate them in a single surprise attack. In order to ensure that this dangerous operation, so critical to their survival, was executed as smoothly as possible, they deliberated for some time and formulated a plan of attack, which required the participation of every member of the band. When their preparations were complete, all the Atna men and women followed the warrior to the caves of the Tseteni, the former carrying their weapons, and the latter holding either torches or bundles of green branches. They finally arrived at the den of the monkey people, the vicinity of which was strewn with human bones, all of them thoroughly gnawed and stripped of flesh. There, the women tied the green branches they had collected into 8 bundles, and affixed each bundle to the end of a long pole. Then they built a roaring fire at the base of the cliff, and held each bundle over the flames until it was smoking. That accomplished, they used the poles to hoist the smoking wood up the side of the cliff, and stuffed the bundles into the mouths of the caves, and in no time, the caves were filled with smoke. Their task complete, the men positioned themselves around the foot of the escarpment, their weapons at the ready. As expected, the monkey people began to emerge from their smoky domicile, screeching as they sought fresh air. One by one, they crawled out of their burrows, only to be struck down by the spears, arrows, and war clubs of the Atna warriors who were waiting for them on the outside. Some of the monkey men fought viciously with their besiegers, and one warrior was killed in the struggle. In spite of this stern resistance, the Atna managed to slaughter what they believed to be every last Tseteni, and returned to their camp later that night, never to be bothered by the tailed ones again. Legend has it that the caves of the Tseteni can still be seen dotting the cliffs along the river, and that fragments of ancient charcoal and scorched arrowheads, relics of the battle between the Atna and the monkey men, can still be found therein. In his report entitled Archaeology in Central Alaska, published in 1939 as Volume 36 of the Anthropological Papers of the American Museum of Natural History, American archaeologist Froelich Gladstone Rainey identified the legendary den of the Tseteni as a collection of 30 rectangular pits located less than a mile from Batselnetas, an old Alaskan village which Fred and Katie John claimed was founded by the same Atna band members who slaughtered the monkey men. Rainey visited these pits, which had been dug into a low bench above an old stream bed which is now dry, and described them as measuring 1 meter in depth and 1 to 1.25 meters in width, overgrown with unusually large spruce trees and covered with a thick mat of slow-growing moss. They are not rectangularly oriented, and one pit is often joined by 2 or 3 others, forming a series of connected excavations. Rainey and his team dug test pits and trenches through and around the pits in the hope of recovering artifacts of archaeological significance, but encountered only scattered pieces of charcoal. Although the legend of the Tseteni has been described as very regional and unique to Atna oral history, the work of 19th and 20th century ethnologists clearly indicates that a number of native tribes throughout the northwestern corner of North America share a traditional belief in predatory tailed men who once prowled the Alaskan and Yukon wilderness. One of the earliest references to this belief appears in the book The Inhabitants of the Northwest Coast of America, an 1839 ethnology written by Baron Ferdinand von Wrangel, the de facto governor of the Tsar-backed Russian-American company which once dominated the fur trade on the Pacific coast. In his book, von Wrangel wrote that the Tanana Indians of central Alaska, the Tanana Indians whose traditional homeland lies west of Atna Territory, and the Ingalik, whose territory lies northwest of Tanana Country, all believed in man-like creatures called Chincat, which lived in caves underground. According to Wrangel's informants, these monsters have tails and are covered like a beast with fur. It must be mentioned that the word Chincat bears close resemblance to Chilkat, a nation of southeasterly Tlingit Indians who excelled in trade and warfare. It seems possible, if not particularly probable, that the tailed Chincat of legend may have been fanciful embellishments of these powerful neighbors. In his article on the Tanana Indians for Volume 6 of the Smithsonian's Handbook of North American Indians, which treats with the indigenous nations of the North American subarctic, ethnologist Robert A. McKinnon wrote that a belief in a race of man-like monsters with tails, who formerly inhabited the area, was prevalent along the south-central border of Alaska and the Yukon Territory. In his 1959 ethnological treatise on the Upper Tanana Indians, he identified these monsters as the Tsetin, or tailed men, creatures described as looking like old men, except that they possess a tail. They lived in holes in the ground in the Upper Tanana region, ravishing women and devouring men. McKinnon recounted one old Upper Tanana legend about the Tsetin, which he learned from 2 natives named Sam and Fred Sam. This story is nearly identical to the classic tale of the Atna Indians, who smoked out and slaughtered a troop of Tseteni on the banks of the Copper River, differing only in the identity of its protagonists and the location in which it is set. This particular story revolves around a band of Upper Tanana Indians from the Tanana River, rather than Atna from the Copper River. Instead of taking place near Slana, Alaska, this story is set in a village located about 2 miles downriver from present-day Tetling, Alaska, about 54 miles or 87 kilometers northeast of Slana, on the opposite side of the Mentasta Mountains. According to this legend, the Tsetin killed every Upper Tanana Indian who trespassed on their territory. One day, McKinnon wrote, an Indian, wiser than the others, sneaked down there. He saw the Tsetsin playing ball with human heads. He carried the news back to Tetlin. That night, the medicine man made a big rain. The next morning, all the Tetlin Indians went down to the Tsetsin holes. They built big fires in front of them. The Tetlin that rushed out were killed with clubs. Others perished in the flames. Still others suffocated by the smoke. All were killed. Another Upper Tanana story which McKinnon learned from two Tanana elders named Old Lucy and Nebezna John involves a battle of wits between a Tsetsin and Tsaosha, the legendary cultural hero of the Tanana. According to this story, a Tsetsin ambushed Tsaosha's wife on a forest trail and killed her. Tsaosha yearned to avenge his wife's death, but was told by his friend the fox that the Tsetsin could not be killed in open combat. Accordingly, he invited the tailed man to play a certain ball game, which he knew he could not resist. While the Tsetsin was preoccupied with this sport, Tsaosha snuck up behind him and killed him with an ice pick. Later that night, the Tsetsin came back to life and returned to his den. Infuriated, Tsaosha sought Fox's counsel a second time, and was informed that the only way to kill the Tsetsin for good was to cut his tail into tiny pieces, bury the pieces in the snow, and pour water over them, so that they became encased in ice. Tsaosha did as Fox instructed him, and effectively put an end to the tailed man's existence. McKinnon went on to describe how members of a particular Gwich'in tribe in northern Alaska, who lived along the shores of Chandalar Lake, believed in a somewhat similar ogre, which was described by a more sophisticated informant as looking like a monkey. The Ayak Indians of the Copper River Delta similarly held that a hairy, man-like animal haunted their own territory. This creature, however, in McKinnon's opinion, more closely resembled a gorilla than a monkey, since it lacked a tail. The Tanana and the Tahltan also believed in a tailed, man-like creature, McKinnon continued, whom the latter described as monkey people. McKinnon suggested that these beliefs call to mind the writings of Father Emile Petito, an oblate missionary who lived among the easterly Dene Indians of the Mackenzie River, in Canada's Northwest Territories, in the late 1800s. In several of his notes and letters, Petito described an old Slavey Dene legend, which contends that the ancestors of the Mackenzie River natives migrated long ago from a westerly land populated with hairy, tailed men. Later on in his book, McKinnon implied that the natives of the Yukon made a distinction between the monkey people and the brush man, a legendary man-eating wild man, whom one old Klondike prospector identified as the Mahoney Man, or the Nakani, of Northwest Territories Indian tradition. Another hairy, long-tailed humanoid of northwestern legend is the Kushtaka, or land otter man, a man-like otter or an otter-like man, which was said to reside on the Alaskan Panhandle. According to Scots-Canadian anthropologist James Tate, in his article Tahltan Tales, published in the October to December 1922 issue of the Journal of American Folklore, some Indians, in speaking English, call them monkey people. The Kushtaka, Tate wrote, were believed to be a kind of spirit which preys on people who become lost in the wilderness. Like the fairies of Celtic folklore, they cause their victims to hallucinate and to become crazy and wander about aimlessly. Some lure lost humans to their watery or subterranean abodes, in which they imprison them forever. Although the Kushtaka are most prominently associated with Tlingit folklore, the Tlingit being the historic sovereigns of the Alaskan Panhandle, they also appear in the legends of the Tahltan Indians, whose traditional homeland lies in southwestern British Columbia and south-central Yukon. At least one traditional Tahltan story featuring this legendary monster, which Tate included in his book, portrays it as an impish kleptomaniac with the mischievous mannerisms of a monkey. This particular tale centers around a young Tlingit man who did not believe in land otter men and was not afraid to venture into the wilderness by himself. One night, while camped alone, this man heard noises in the darkness. Suspecting his nocturnal visitors to be wild animals, he built a roaring fire and loaded his musket. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, the man spotted a strange figure watching him at the edge of the firelight. He raised his musket and made to shoot the figure, but found that he could not pull the trigger. At that moment, he lost consciousness. For some time, the young Tlingit flitted between lucidity and oblivion. In fragmented bouts of consciousness, he saw the strange creature throwing snow onto his fire, as if in an attempt to smother it. The mysterious visitor was soon joined by a similar-looking companion, which assisted the former with its task. The young man struggled for control of his senses, and succeeded in leveling his musket at the unwanted visitors several times, but always found himself incapable of pulling the trigger. When dawn came, the man woke up beside the ashes of his campfire, and found that his gun was missing. Aside from the absence of his firearm, there were no visible signs of the mysterious events of the night. Shaken, the young man picked himself up and started for his village. The trail to the village wound through a narrow defile between two hills. At the entrance of this passage, the man found his missing gun leaning against a stump. After that, the story concludes, the young man believed in the Kustaka and was afraid of them. American anthropologist John R. Swanton included a number of traditional Tlingit Kustaka tales in his 1909 book, Tlingit Myths and Texts. Several of these stories make frequent mention of the prominent tale each Kustaka was said to possess. One story, for example, tells of a Tlingit woman who was saved from drowning by the Kustaka and taken to the realm of the Land Otter Men, where she transformed into a Kustaka woman herself. She married a Land Otter man and had many children, all of which retained sufficient semblance of their maternal heritage to pass as human beings to the casual observer. From their waist up, Swanton wrote, they looked like human beings. Below, they were otters, and they had tails. One day, the woman took her children to visit her brother, who had long since given her up for dead. Although initially shocked by her strange otter-like appearance, the brother welcomed his sister into his home, and introduced his own children to their tailed cousins. During their visit, the sisters' tailed children helped their uncle catch a prodigious quantity of devilfish, or octopi, which he liked to use as fish bait. There is an implication that the children used their tails to accomplish this, along with other chores with which their uncle asked them to assist him, evoking the useful prehensile tails unique to New World monkeys. To many current members of the Tlingit and Tsimshian First Nations of Alaska, Yukon, and British Columbia, the Kustaka remains a very real threat to travelers who lose their way in the Pacific Northwest. The tailed ones of Otna and Tanana folklore, on the other hand, are generally regarded as monsters of the legendary past, no more to be feared by modern man than cave lions or saber-toothed tigers. Even if the campfire stories of the predatory cave-dwelling monkey men of the Copper and Tanana rivers have any truth at their core, any potential danger posed by the Tsetani is supposed to have been quashed generations ago, when the last of the tailed ones were wiped out in the shadows of the Mentasta Mountains. Despite the reassurances of native folklore, sightings of mysterious monkey-like creatures are still reported from time to time in the wilderness of North America. Distinguishable from reports of other hairy wildmen by the mention of a tail, some of these sightings have nonetheless made their way into collections of classic Sasquatch sightings, such as the writings of the late Canadian journalist John Willison Green. In his 1970 book, Year of the Sasquatch, for example, Green described the experience of a man named Gordon Ferrier, who claimed to have seen a monkey-like creature near his home on the Mamquam River, a tributary of the Squamish River, on the outskirts of the town of Squamish, British Columbia. He saw the animal one morning in June 1969, standing in a ditch across the road from his home. It was covered with hair, walked on two legs, and appeared to have a bushy tail. Later, Ferrier discovered strange three-toed tracks in the ditch where the creature had stood, which measured 15 inches in length and a handspan in breadth. He finished his report by claiming that dogs in the area acted very upset on many occasions. An article in the June 11, 1969 issue of the Squamish Times identified Ferrier as the boarder of Paul Grattan and his wife Norma, who lived on No Name Road just south of the Mamquam Bridge, just upriver from the Mamquam's confluence with the Squamish River. According to the article, Ferrier first saw the creature 3 weeks earlier, in mid-May 1969, after it ripped open a window in Grattan's home. Ferrier investigated the commotion and saw the mysterious creature disappear into the brush near the back of the house. He estimated it to be 5 foot 3 inches in height and described it as having a long tail and being covered with reddish fur. The following day, Mrs. Grattan and her children stayed at the home of their neighbor, Trudy Gulliman, fearful that their unwanted visitor might return. Their fears were justified. During their absence, someone, or something, entered their house through a window and left a pile of moss on the floor before departing. About a week later, at about 6:15 a.m., Gordon Ferrier looked up from the Grattans' dining room window and saw the same creature he had spotted before, standing in the bush across from the house. He described it as having small pointed ears, reddish hair, and a pushed-in face like a Pekingese dog, and said that it walked erect on 2 legs. Startled, he called to Paul Grattan, who arrived just in time to see a long tail and a shock of reddish hair disappear into the bush. The 2 men went outside to investigate and found tracks deep enough to have been left by a 300-pound animal. Mrs. Grattan reported the incident to the local Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who took plaster casts of the strange footprints before destroying the originals with a rake. In his book, Green indicated that the plasters the police cast were later destroyed. On the advice of the Mounties, Mr. Gulliman hung a bag containing bread and honey from a tree outside his home in order to determine whether the creature was a bear. The bag remained untouched, which the Gullimans and the Grattans took as an indication that the strange animal was not a member of the Ursine family. According to an article in the June 5, 1969 issue of the Vancouver Sun, Mrs. Grattan, Mrs. Gulliman, and other Mamquam housewives described the police as being uncooperative, claiming that they treated their case with bemused tolerance, bordering on open amusement. Some of those who have written on monkey sightings on Canada's west coast have proposed that the subjects of such reports are, in fact, feral monkeys who eke out a living in the rainforests of British Columbia, whose ancestors were transplanted from some tropical abode generations ago and managed to acclimate to their new environment. Most champions of this theory suspect that the first wild monkeys to make their homes in the Pacific Northwest were escapees of some wind-tossed Spanish treasure galleon, destined for the Imperial Ming Court or the Habsburg menageries of Spain or Italy. Through some accident, they escaped from their cages somewhere along the coast of Western Canada, clambered ashore, and took to the woods. One proponent of this theory was a woodsman named Mike King, who lived on Vancouver Island in the early 1900s. According to an article in the December 30th, 1904 issue of the Ottawa Evening Journal, King made an effort to learn the local explanation for the mysterious hairy wildmen who were spotted from time to time flitting through the forests of Vancouver Island. Their story, the article claimed, which King wormed from an old native with much difficulty, is to the effect that, at the coming of the Spaniards to the west coast, an immense monkey escaped from one of the vessels and took refuge in the forest wilderness. British celebrity explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes heard a similar explanation for the alleged head-hunting wildmen of the South Nakani River in Canada's Northwest Territories during his expedition to the region in 1971. In his 1973 book, The Headless Valley, he wrote, "We heard tales of Spanish galleons shipwrecked on the rocky coastline of British Columbia with cargoes of apes. The theory was that some of the apes escaped ashore and headed inland. The long winters killed off all but a few, who, finding hot sulfurous springs somewhere in the Nakani region, survived over the years and were the cause of the various decapitations." While modern sightings of tailed monkey-like creatures are quite rare in the wilderness of British Columbia, they are surprisingly common in the eastern half of the continent, particularly in the Appalachian Mountain region of the eastern United States. Cryptozoologists, those who study elusive animals, the existence of which the general scientific community has yet to acknowledge, have dubbed this mysterious primate the devil monkey. Some cryptozoologists are of the opinion that there are enough consistencies in most devil monkey sightings to support the idea that the animals they describe belong to the same species, the characteristics of which cryptozoologist George M. Aberhart outlined in Volume 1 of his 2001 encyclopedia, Mysterious Creatures, A Guide to Cryptozoology. According to Aberhart, the devil monkey stands from 3 to 8 feet in height, is covered with light brown to black hair, has pointed ears, and sports a baboon-like muzzle. Many of those who claim to have encountered it report seeing a long tail, which has alternately been described as black, bushy, or hairless. The creature has been observed walking on its hind legs only, as well as on all fours, leaving behind foot-long tracks crowned with 3 rounded toe prints. An aggressive animal, it is said to have attacked both dogs and humans, and to have killed livestock, and has been heard hooting, screaming, and whistling. Cryptozoologist Loren Coleman detailed several devil monkey sightings in his 1983 book, Mysterious America. The first story, which Coleman discovered in Jesse W. Harris's article Myths and Legends from Southern Illinois in the March 1946 issue of the magazine Hoosier Folklore, took place in the summer of 1941. While hunting squirrels along Gum Creek near the city of Mount Vernon, Illinois, a preacher, whom Coleman identified as Reverend Marsh Harpole, was approached by a large animal that looked something like a baboon, which leapt out of a tree and began walking towards him. The Reverend struck the creature with the barrel of his gun and fired several shots in the air, successfully frightening it away. Sometime after the preacher's encounter, local farmers reported hearing blood-curdling shrieks at night, which seemed to emanate from the wooded bottomlands along the area's creeks. Hunters began seeing strange tracks during their rambles, and the dog of one farmer from Bonnie, Illinois, was killed by some mysterious predator. Fearful that a panther was on the prowl, a group of locals banded together and resolved to kill the creature. It soon became clear that the strange nocturnal screamer was no wildcat. One night, a driver claimed to have seen the unusual creature bound across a road along the Big Muddy River, about 50 miles from the preacher's initial sighting. Although he neglected to provide a detailed description of the animal he saw, he was sure it was not a panther. Later, a hunter spotted mysterious animal tracks along the more northerly West Oka River. Several alleged witnesses described how the animal jumped from place to place, leading some to suspect that it was a kangaroo, which had escaped from a zoo. Despite their efforts, local hunters were unable to bag the mysterious animal, and interest in it gradually faded away. Cryptozoologist Chad Armand described several devil monkey sightings in an article in Volume 2, Number 1 of the North American Biofortean Review, the first of which took place early one morning in 1959. While driving down a rural road near Saltville, Virginia, the parents of a Northwest Virginian woman named Paulette Boyd were charged by what appeared to be a large monkey. The creature sprang from a ditch as their car drove past and slammed into the passenger window, leaving a deep scratch in the paint. Paulette's mother, who was sitting in the passenger seat, described the creature as having light taffy-colored hair, with a white blaze down its neck and underbelly. It stood on 2 large, well-muscled back legs, and had shorter front legs or arms. This particular specimen did not appear to have a tail. After crashing into the passenger window, the monkey loped alongside the car for a few moments, and continued to chase it after it was outdistanced. When he had put some distance between his car and the vicious primate, Paulette's father produced his revolver and contemplated driving back to shoot the creature, but reluctantly agreed to leave it be at his wife's fervent insistence. Several days after this incident, Paulette continued, 2 nurses in the Saltville area were driving home from work early one morning and were attacked by an unknown creature who ripped the convertible top from their car before they escaped. A search party was formed, but the dogs brought in to track the creature refused to follow the trail. It has never been explained. Years later, Paulette's brother showed their mother a magazine illustration of a prehistoric lemur-like primate, whose fossilized remains had been unearthed somewhere in the United States. Their mother remarked that the creature she had seen in 1959 closely resembled the image in the magazine. Paulette went on to describe 2 more sightings of similar creatures, which she heard from her friends and family members. The animal in the last sighting she described allegedly walked on all 4s and stood around 3 feet high. It was covered in shaggy, rough, graying-brown fur, and had a long muzzle and small pointed ears. Its hind legs were longer than its front legs. It bore visible claws, and it had a hairless tail, which the witness likened to that of an opossum. Lauren Coleman's aforementioned book, Mysterious America, describes 3 more alleged devil monkey encounters, which took place in late April and early May 1973. Each of these sightings occurred in the same rural area outside Enfield, Illinois, about 40 miles southeast of Reverend Harpole's 1941 Gum Creek encounter. Witnesses described the creature they saw as a gray monkey, which stood about 5 feet tall, and claimed to have heard it howling and shrieking. Another sighting was reported by a woman named Debbie Cross, whose story was recorded by researchers Ron Schaffner and Kenny Young, and published in Coleman's book. In the early hours of June 26, 1997, Cross was watching television in her rural home outside Duncansville, Ohio, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, when her dogs began barking at something outside. She turned on the porch light to see a fur-covered, monkey-like creature about 30 feet away, standing at the edge of a pond. It was about 3 to 4 feet tall and gray in color, she told Schaffner and Young. It had large dark eyes and rounded ears extended above the head. It had real long arms and a short tail. It made a gurgling sound. The creature glanced at Cross before skipping across her lawn, walking on its hind legs and apparently balancing himself with the knuckles of its front arms. It walked along a barbed wire fence before disappearing from view, screeching as it vanished into the gloom. Chad Arment described several more devil monkey sightings in an article in Volume 2, Number 2 of the North American Biofortean Review, which was published in the year 2000. One report was furnished by a woman from Ohio, who contacted Arment after reading his aforementioned article in an earlier issue of the same publication. One night, while driving on a rural highway between Roanoke, Virginia and Elizabeth City, North Carolina, the informant was startled by a strange creature, which leapt across the road in front of her car. The creature was not a wolf. It was all black, with very short, sleek fur, pointy ears, and a long, thin tail. It seemed cat-like, yet not like any cat I have ever seen. I would say it was easily 6 feet tall when standing. Its torso looked very much like that of a very thin man, and its head resembled a man, almost, with a pointy beard. However, its hind legs are more like a wildcat, or dog, I guess. Very muscular and thick. Another alleged devil monkey sighting, which took place on September 9, 2001, in the rural community of Danville, New Hampshire, is listed in George Aberhart's encyclopedia. The anonymous witness described the animal as a giant black monkey, and claimed that it appeared 8 more times in a 2-week period following the first sighting. Relatively recently, a couple of unverifiable sightings of mysterious monkeys have been reported in Canada. A young cryptozoologist named Thomas Morgan of Kawartha Lakes, Ontario, discovered one of these stories in an online database called the Paranormal Studies and Inquiry Canada, and wrote about it on his own website, superbugtom.com. The story in question was submitted by one Ian Harper, who claimed to have encountered what he described as a big white monkey near Lake Scugog, Ontario, while biking with his dog in 1992. He described the creature as being about 3 feet tall, with long willowy arms and a large head. When his dog prepared to attack it, the monkey stood up on its back legs and uttered a deep, sonorous grunt. Morgan described another encounter on his website, which was alleged to have taken place in the mid-2010s. According to Morgan, who presumably heard this story from the witnesses themselves, 2 Cree sisters from Jackhead, Manitoba, claimed to have seen a large monkey-like creature cross the Manitoba Highway 6 sometime in the mid-2010s. Morgan curiously also places the sighting near Devil's Lake, Manitoba, which is located 13 kilometers east of Manitoba Highway 5, but nowhere near Highway 6. The sisters described the creature as being 4 feet tall and having brown hair, large shoulders, a sloped back, and a tail. Over the years, various cryptozoologists have proposed a number of theories as to the nature of the devil monkey of the eastern United States. In his second article in the North American Bio14 Review, Chad Arment suggested a connection between the devil monkey and the wampus cat of Cherokee Indian tradition, and put forth 2 potential candidates for its identity. The Hanuman langur, an Old World monkey native to India, and Propithecus brasiliensis, an extinct 50-pound New World monkey whose fossils have been discovered in a cave in Brazil, believed to be the largest New World monkey to ever exist. In his encyclopedia, George Aberhart suggested that devil monkeys might be pet monkeys, zoo monkeys, or research monkeys, which escaped into the wild, perhaps on account of some natural disaster like Hurricane Andrew, which devastated Florida in 1992. Aberhart went on to cite several troops of feral monkeys known or strongly suspected to live in the American wilderness, including squirrel monkeys, rhesus macaques, and capuchin monkeys believed to dwell in the Florida Everglades, as well as a troop of Japanese macaques which run wild in Texas. The late cryptozoologist Mark A. Hall drew a connection between the devil monkey and the Nalusa Falea, or long black being, a shadowy monster of Choctaw Indian legend, said to possess long pointy ears. He suggested that devil monkeys might be surviving specimens of Theropithecus oswaldi, a 250-pound East African baboon, believed by most primatologists to have gone extinct during the Pleistocene epoch. In Mysterious America, Lauren Coleman proposed a potential connection between devil monkeys and a rash of mysterious kangaroo sightings, which took place across the Midwestern United States throughout the 20th century, suggesting that the devil monkey is really some kind of giant baboon that moves by saltation, leaping as do kangaroos. In his 1999 book, The Field Guide to Bigfoot, Yeti, and Other Mysterious Primates Worldwide, which he co-authored with fellow cryptozoologist Patrick Hugh, Coleman placed the devil monkey in an animal class which he dubbed giant monkey. Giant monkeys are generally 4 to 6 feet tall, he wrote. The smaller ones, juveniles, often resemble wallabies or baby kangaroos. They have muscular bodies, with barrel chests, arms thicker than a man's, very strong legs, and a thick tail. Their faces are often described as being dog-like or baboon-like, with dark piercing eyes and pointed ears. They have short to shaggy hair, varying in color from black to red, often with a heavy coat around the shoulders in males. Is the devil monkey of the eastern United States some sort of prehistoric primate, whispered of in the oral histories of the Cherokee and Choctaw nations? Is it an escapee from a zoo or research lab, or a simple misidentification? Does it have any connection to the mysterious creature spotted by Gordon Ferrier in Squamish, British Columbia in the summer of 1969, or with the sinister cave-dwelling Tsetani of Alaskan and Yukon legend? Until a specimen is killed or captured, these questions will remain unanswerable, leaving the legend of the devil monkey one of North America's many great unsolved mysteries.